we going to try and cover today? A number of things. Firstly, we want to be able to know what it is and why it is that we think that management systems are so integral or important to this new regime under the Uniform Law. We're going to look at what it is that customarily triggers audits at the attention of the regulatory agencies. We're going to look obviously at the management systems, the 7 management systems that I've recommended and detailed in that document you have. We will look at some worked examples. We haven't got time to go through them all, unfortunately, but we'll do 2 or 3, depending on how time goes. And then finally, we'll look at issues around the implementation of the system, how one actually gets started on this project, or even, of course, if you're in practice now, which most of you are, how you review what you've got and perhaps potentially improve it. And finally, there is an offer at the end, which I promised everybody, in the event that you want some assistance, how much it might cost, what I can do for you, and why I think I might be able to help you in your specific circumstances. So why did I get interested in this particular subject? It's a little bit of a dry topic, I'd have to admit. It's not one that engenders a high level of excitement, but since the Uniform Law was promulgated, I've become involved with a handful of firms that have already had the attention of the regulator in their respective states. I've seen up close and personal how difficult it has been for those firms to comply, and I've looked carefully at the circumstances which have actually caused the regulator to get the attention of the firm in the first place. And that's quite an interesting story in itself. So I wanted to share those insights with you. Also wanted to reflect a little bit on my history when I was part of the management team, a 3-headed monster, if you like, of managing partners who put together the DLA Phillips Fox experience. We brought together 7 firms over 3 continents. I had the chance to look at systems and processes all the way across Australia, in Asia and in New Zealand, and the sheer difficulty in integrating those firms, integrating their policies, their IT, their systems, their training and supervision, gave me a lot of hands-on experience of just how widely diverse some of these firms can be. And I've no doubt from what I've seen more recently, that diversity remains, and so the need to introduce systems to drive your firm and to provide the scaffold, if you like, upon which compliance is driven is kind of critical. And I'll talk about 1 or 2 of those cases that I've been involved in, because I think there's some salutary lessons in all of that for us. And I think it's made me go back and work through in the detail that appears, I hope, in that handout, to actually understand all of the obligations, and there are so many of them. The management systems that I've created or described, I'm confident now, having had it checked by external agencies, describe every single obligation that's contained in the Act and in all of the rules. And for anybody who's looked at them even briefly, you'll realise how much of an overlap there is between the rules and the Act, between past practice and current practice. And in order to put all of that into a series of sensible boxes and to be confident that you've actually covered the field is really what this seminar is all about. So in the first point, I've talked about focusing on management systems, and I've already had a couple of people come back to me online and say, now look, the Act or the rules, they don't require that you have management systems. There's no definition of what a management system is. Why the focus on management systems? Well, I think that can be answered very, very easily by a quick reference to the actual text of the Act and the rules themselves. I don't want to take you to that quickly. You don't bother to look it up yourselves at the moment. I'm going to read it to you. But firstly, there's a incredible reliance on management systems that comes through time and time again within the actual Act itself. The notion, if I just lean down here and grab my Act, the notion, the whole basis of the Act And the unusual part of it, if you like, is its emphasis on the responsibility of the principals of a practice. And if you look at section 33, 34 and 35, that's the area I'm talking about, because there's an obligation in there for the law practice, and in particular the principals, to comply and put in place compliance within the firm. It doesn't say how you do it, doesn't even use the word management system at that stage. And that doesn't become obvious until later when you review what it is that the Act requires of a regulatory agency in the event it finds some default. And we'll talk about that again in a moment. So that collective responsibility, combined with the regulatory powers that the agency have, is what drew my attention to the idea of trying to capture these requirements in a series of management systems as such. Now, the way I've divided up the systems, you could no doubt think of different names and different ways of dividing up those obligations. But in the end, whatever the title are, the substance must be there, and it must, at the very least, set out and require a set of systems which at the very least complies with the obligations under the Act and the rules, and hopefully provide some good business outcomes for you as well. Not to be underestimated, because that's certainly where we came from in the 80s and 90s before these obligations became so manifest and so extensive. We were looking for good business outcomes as well as compliance, not just compliance. And that's why I titled the seminar Compliance Plus, because it's not just something merely to be concerned about that you comply or you don't, so to speak. So the thesis effectively is that if you don't focus on management systems, the chances are that you can't and won't comply. If you don't have at least these management systems in place, then the probability of non-compliance is extremely high. I said I'd take you next to the regulatory and enforcement powers, and I think this is where the obvious bite comes in, and where it is that the wording starts to appear that references management systems, because Section 35 talks about the liability of principals. We've talked about the collective responsibility of principals for default by individual practitioners in the firm, so we understand that. So what's the defence? Well, you're liable if the principal was or ought reasonably to have been in a position to influence the conduct of the law practice. Well, any partner, any director, any senior partner clearly is in that position. You attend partners' meetings, you make suggestions, you listen to proposals. You may well have a managing partner, you may not. Maybe collective responsibility, maybe just 2 or 3 of you. It doesn't matter. The fact is, if you're in a position to influence the conduct of the law practice, and by conduct I mean the conduct in creating and enforcing and training with respect to these systems, then it seems quite clear to me that you're potentially liable. And the balance of the section talks about the failure to do so, of course, amounting to unsatisfactory professional conduct, and we all know where that goes to in the end. I don't want to linger on that in particular, but I do want to take you now to the specific power that the regulatory agencies have, and that appears in 256 and 257. We know about audits. We know they've got the power to audit. It's interesting in 256 that all it takes to trigger an audit is a complaint. Doesn't say it has to come from a client, just a complaint. We'll talk about where these complaints might arise a little later, but it's quite interesting in the experience I've had with a couple of these firms recently where those complaints have actually originated from, and it may make you reevaluate what it is that you're being exposed to with these powers. So a compliance audit can be triggered by a complaint. It's got to be based on reasonable grounds, and certainly in my discussions with the regulatory agencies both in New South Wales and Victoria, they stress very heavily that they won't act precipitously, they'll act reasonably, etc., and I've no doubt they will, and they do. But nevertheless, the power is there. The question is, how is it exercised, extent of the discretion they've got, and what they can do if they find something is amiss. And I particularly draw your attention to 257. That's the section which gives the regulatory agency power to give a management system direction. Now, as far as I know, none of those have been given as yet. And it's not that I think they should have, even in the circumstances, somewhat dire ones that I was involved in recently on behalf of a client. But you'll note in 257 talks about a management system direction is a direction to ensure that appropriate management systems are implemented and maintained to enable the provision of legal services by the law practice in accordance with the rules in the Act. So there it is in black and white, the power to give directions to ensure that you've got appropriate systems in place. Now, the fact that management systems aren't described, the fact that they're not actually mandated, I think is not to the point, in fact. It's quite clear that that's the expectation of the Act and the rules. I quite frankly can't see how anybody can successfully contend that systems and management systems in particular are something that are marginal, you don't really need or have them. I think anybody in business understands that they're both the scaffold and the glue upon which successful business is constructed and maintained. Just think about how frequently the staff are changing in your organisation now. It's not unusual for me to go into firms and see a track record of turnover of staff where the average turnover, the average longevity of any solicitor is less than 3 years. Interestingly enough, I was talking to somebody from Google the other day and they were telling me the average tenure there, prestigious job as it is about 18 months. Now, I'm not saying we're going to go that far, but nevertheless, you can see the need to have these systems in place so that you can be confident about the way in which the people you employ and your partners and your fellow directors are doing the right thing, and that you've thought about what these things might be and you're actually putting in place the necessary systems to make them work. So, of course, there are other powers they've got. You know about those: limiting supervision, limiting your right to practice, disqualifying you from practice, etc., etc. One of the immediate issues that I've struck with an audit, despite the fact that it was not a relatively serious matter that was highlighted, was the problem the practice had as soon as it became known amongst the staff that an audit had taken place, that directions were being given, and that potentially supervision was imminent. And it led to the exit of several practitioners from the firm. Didn't want to be associated with anything like that, even though they weren't personally involved. They didn't want to be tarred with that brush. So I think that's something, again, you've got to think about the effects on your clients, effects on your staff, effects on your morale, and just how long is it going to take, and can you really keep these types of audits and this sort of inquiry under wraps, as one client of mine had tried to do, albeit unsuccessfully. Word leaks out. So again, you've got to have a risk management plan in place, and these management systems are really nothing more or less than a risk management regime that I commend to you. So let's move on from there. I think the best analogy I could come up with, bearing in mind that I have a slight interest in sailing and ships and what have you, was thinking about Moby Dick and the Pequod and what it is that one has to do if one is the owner of a whaling ship. And you've got a strategy, you've got a business to run, you're providing the physical facilities, you have to have a chain of command, you have a number of teams that man these little boats that go out with the harpoons to chase the whales. There's got to be discipline, there's got to be resources. All of these ingredients are present and required, and the whole ship of state won't work, won't float, won't capture whales unless all of these systems are in place. Quite obvious in a sort of a whaling environment. They're physical, they're tangible, the harpoons, the sails, the provisions, the hiring of the right, get it right, Duncan, the crew, the onboarding, to use that terrible Americanism, necessary to introduce them to the systems that run on this particular ship. These are very similar to the obligations I think that any principal has, any owner of a legal practice has. You need to have these in place, and again, people have communicated with me and said, look, the stuff about strategy and business models and all that sort of thing, that's not something that we really have to be worried about. Well, in my submission, you do have to be worried about it. You think of the owners of a whaling ship and the captain strategizing about where it is they're going to go to capture whales. Well, they can go down to the Antarctic, they can go to the Atlantic, they can go to the Pacific, lots of places they can go. That amounts to a strategy, a direction, a series of choices that people are making. And they need to decide, and then they communicate that to the crew. Now you might think, well, where's the relevance of that to a law firm? Well, I'll give you one very good example, and one of them is my very recent experience with a firm under attack, as it were, by one of the agencies. And in that case, the firm had upwards of 15 odd solicitors, was operating across 3 states, and had never really promulgated a strategy. What was the outcome? The outcome was that a number of the solicitors were doing work in areas which were completely unknown to the managing group. They were out doing family work when they had no family expertise. They were doing conveyancing work when they shouldn't have been doing. They didn't have the systems, they didn't have the knowledge. They were simply trying to hit budget and doing whatever it took. Even the advertising was misleading. They were claiming to have expertise when they didn't. And of course, as soon as a regulatory agency comes in through the door, even on the basis of one complaint, the inquiry widens and these things become more obvious. And so it takes very little to open up the interior of a firm when the auditor's present. He's looking at files, he's looking at your IT system, he's looking at your financial system, and he's hearing about from staff what it is that they think is right or wrong with the firm. And it neatly leads, I think, to my next point, which I think is important, and that's the question of how audits get triggered. And I said I'd touch on this briefly, and we've mentioned the first on the list, the complaints. Now that's the classic one. Clients complain. They complain about the size of the bill, the lack of communication. They then go to the regulatory agency comes to you, and it might all be resolved very easily. But what if it isn't? And one of the things that the regulatory agency I was dealing with looked at first in the spate of complaints that have been made about one particular firm was whether the firm had a complaint management system in place. Could the managing partner, could the management group actually tell what complaints had been made, how they'd been resolved, what the complaint had been concerned with? And it was that history which wasn't there. Now, of course, the management group alleged that they knew what was going on, that they were managing these complaints. No documentation, no emails been retained, no training that had been given to the staff about what to do if they did have a complaint. And so you can see straight away that the audit ears went up like the proverbial hare, and it was off and running. If they didn't have that system, what other systems didn't they have? And so it went on from there. The next one on the list, affecting employees. Now that is a real risk. We all know, I think, and I've probably been in the business for 30 plus years now, how much bad odour sometimes accompanies the departure of an employee, let alone a partner or a fellow director. And again, in another example I've had recently, all the complaints that the regulatory agency were acting upon, all of them originated from defecting employees and an ex-partner. They were all out for various reasons, and let's assume it's for the best of reasons, only they thought that the firm really wasn't up to snuff. Now, that may or may not have been correct, it doesn't really matter. But it provides them with an opportunity to put pressure on the old employer, as it were, to negotiate, in this case, as I found out, or to try and negotiate under pressure of regulatory intervention, the extent of the amount owing on a respective file, trying to negotiate it down, trying to encourage the former firm to let more files go than they might otherwise be happy. And you can see the immediate potential that this type of whistleblowing has to be very destructive and divisive within the firm. And as I said, one example I acted on, that was the sole cause of the regulatory agency intervention. And it was even to the extent that proceedings had been lodged against the firm by an ex-employee of somewhat dubious merit, but nevertheless, the distraction element, the amount of time responding to the audit, the loss of face with clients and internal employees, you can well imagine. When a file is transferred, classic example again, when the client moves on, asks for a file to be transferred, there's an argument about the costs, the new solicitors busily negotiating, and again, may encourage, we don't know in some cases, may encourage the client to go direct to the regulatory agency or in fact complain themselves, that is the solicitor complains, and off goes the hair again. And one can well imagine that with, for instance, the sale of a business, the sale of your practice, you've got a new purchaser, unhappy about what he or she has purchased, doesn't like what they see, want to negotiate down the price. Here's another lever they can pull in the event they can point to conduct which is unbecoming, as it were. So lots of potential areas besides merely client complaint. Certainly the most common one, but not the only one by a long shot, and perhaps not even the most difficult to deal with. But at one point I do stress, please get a complaint management system in place so that when and if you're ever tackled about it, you've got the records, and more importantly, you know when a complaint's coming. And I don't care how small or large it is. When I was the managing partner of Phillips Fox in Melbourne, every account that went out had my name on the bottom and an invitation to contact me in the event the client was unhappy. Whether you go that far is up to you, but you can see how important I think it is that you are very much in the loop when it comes to client complaints. So let's move on a bit. We've talked about how audits get triggered, if you like, and what are the contributing factors? What have I found or seen out there in the legal environment which seems to attract the attention of the auditors more than you might imagine? And in the firms I've been into, and this is not just a characteristic of those that have been the subject of regulatory intervention, this is a systemic problem right across the profession. I've talked about how everybody has a different system, for instance. Partners like to do things their own way. There's a certain reluctance in any management group or any particular group of owners or directors to actually look at what the practices are that are being carried out in the various parts of the practice and see whether it really does match what, as a group, they've decided they should be doing. So there's a lack of will, there's a lack of commitment, there's sometimes a lack of knowledge, and an embarrassment almost to raise these things, particularly with your fellow partners. And that's highly dangerous. If you're going to go to the trouble of instituting some of these systems, you want to make sure they're adhered to, and that one or two partners, for instance, are not setting a very bad example to the staff, because rest assured the staff will follow the example of the partners. We all know that, we've all seen that, and it only takes one partner in one area to attract attention, and suddenly you may be triggering an audit. So that's something that's very important to keep an eye on. So now I want to talk to the actual characteristics of these so-called management systems that I've devised. And you'll see, if you look on page 1 of your handout, I chanced my hand in describing sort of 10 or 11 odd characteristics. Now, none of it's rocket science, but you'll see them listed there. I won't read through them. I'm not even going to discuss them, because I do think that they're all so basic and so obvious that they're really beyond argument. You could probably add a couple more to it. But I think there are several things in there that need to be borne in mind, and I hope are reflected in the way in which I've dealt with each respective management system as I've described it in the latter part of this document. In other words, if you've got a management system and you claim it's working or you think it's sufficient, check it against this list of 11 characteristics and see whether you think it complies, and if not, why doesn't it? Because I think they're all essential. And we'll go on now to look at the so-called 7 systems. There are really only I think 6, because the 7th is the list of obligations that principals have that I've managed to shepherd into that particular heading. And when you get to that, if you haven't already read it, you'll probably be as astonished as I was to see just how extensive those obligations are and why they read back with such force over all these other systems. And that's one of the fundamental points I want to make about these systems, is that they are not standalone systems. They are all dependent upon each other. They all relate to each other. And the absence of any one of them, in my opinion, will inevitably mean that in some manner, shape or form, the firm will not comply. Now, I'm open to suggestions as to why that might not be the case, but I was somewhat surprised, I suppose, when I was documenting this for one of my clients, just how extensive these systems needed to be in order for you to be able to sleep at night, to get this particular monkey off your back, to feel that you've actually covered the bases that you need to have covered. And let me say immediately, I'd be the first one to admit that over my career, there's probably no firm that could lay their hand on their heart and say that they were compliant to the extent that I'm suggesting. But at least you know what the gold standard is, so to speak. And if you fall short, well, you're very human and you're very much like me. But I don't think it's really beyond the wit or wisdom of most of us to do this, particularly where we've got such terrific technology and such terrific data, which, if you think about where I was back in the 80s with no computer-based systems, and we were forced to rummage around in files to find precedents and to physically check everything in the accounts department by actually looking at ledger cards and the like, you'll realise that the ability to go in through your system, whatever it is, interrogate it, get the management reports out of it, is so much better and so much easier, providing you use the tools. And again, both of the firms that I've advised recently had some wonderful software, but they didn't use it. They didn't know how to use it. They hadn't really implemented it. They hadn't got the management reports. And if they'd got some, they hadn't acted on them. So get the tools by all means, but please use them and find out how to use them and make sure that that knowledge is pretty well distributed throughout the firm, because if there's one thing that makes a big difference in a firm, it's the extent to which it uses its IT to not only set up these systems, but to monitor compliance, to record default or deficiencies, and to document what it is that's been done over a period of time, because this is not a one-hit wonder. This is something that needs to be done and continue to be done every year without fail, in order to ensure that compliance becomes a way of life and not just the flavour of the month for the management group. So let's look at the first one in a little bit of detail. If you turn to page 4, it must have been there to help us out. Just turn to page 4 of your handout, and I will just wander through this one to start with, client relationships, because just go back there. Client relationships, I picked this one as the first example, and you can see straight away what I was saying about the amount of data on the screen behind me. Please don't read it from there. Get your hard copy out like I am and refer to that. But I do want to just make a couple of broad points about the way these systems are described in this document and how it is I suggest you approach this particular problem. And that is that what I've done is initially, and I've highlighted this area here in red, there are the 9 characteristics or requirements of the system, and this is a common layout for every one of the 7 systems. In other words, the 7 criteria, if you like, that need to be documented and described and understood are here. First, the description of the system and its goals, what it's designed to achieve, where is it referred to in the documentation. It could be in the firm policy manual, employment contracts. You need to think about every one of these examples. Where are the references in the uniform rules to, and in the Act, of course, to these requirements, so you can trace them back to these individual requirements? Where are additional resources available? that you think are going to help with the implementation, training and reinforcement and actually operationalise this system. Where's the training going to be? And you see I've noted induction, online tutorials, internal and external training sessions, CPD, all of that stuff. It's just to trigger you thinking, yes, okay, we've done that, or we're going to do that, or we will do that on a regular basis. Here's another one, enforcement. Now, I've lost track of how many times I've been into a firm where they say, yes, we do this, yes, we do that, yes, we do the other, and all I find is exceptions. Exceptions are human. I was guilty plenty of them in my time. But again, if you can't point to where defaulters, as it were, have been reminded or sent off to train, or in some cases had their employment terminated, as I had to do in 1 or 2 cases myself, then again, an audit is going to be a pretty embarrassing process. Where is the evidence? Again, this is a real problem for many firms. If you're not collecting evidence along the way, and obviously your IT system will do that. It's not hard to do these days, to keep electronic files, to add to them systematically over a number of years, to have audit trails on your financial documentation, etc. Not difficult to do, but surprisingly poorly maintained in many firms, particularly when it comes to HR issues. If you've got a solicitor who's not doing the right thing, has he been spoken to? When was he last reviewed? What was said? What action was agreed on? What did he or she do? Those are the critical issues that you've got to keep on documented, collecting, and able to produce. Again, it's no good when the auditor comes knocking at the door, as in I had in one case. They were busily trying to reconstruct this from emails going back 3 or 4 years. I'm sure it can be done, but I'd rather not do it that way. And finally, how is it linked to the supervisory system? The point being that under this heading of client relationships, we have the goals, and then we have these other 9 criteria. And across all of these systems, we have the same 9 criteria, and we have different headings. And of course, we have different references to the uniform law and rules. But if you put them all in place, then every one of those obligations is tracked, trained for, evidenced by, enforced, and set out or referred to in various other documents or online materials that you should have available to your staff. So that's the genesis of the way in which I've set it out. And if we look to some more detail, just quickly, and I'm taking you now through those 9 criteria. First of all, what are the description? What is it that you're trying to achieve? There are the points, the 5 points. The next one is where is it set out or referred to? The uniform law, other documentation, that's where it needs to be. I mean, if you're talking about, for instance, the control structure within the firm, the structure, the hierarchy, who does what, who's responsible for what, who's accountable, then it's all going to be tied up in the employment contract, the description of the nature of the duties. That's the type of thing that needs to be evidenced and be able to be put before an auditor in the event that there is a default. You want to be able to say, look, describe the work, we had this process of review, he or she made one mistake, we had a system in place, they could have done the right thing, they chose not to, it's not our fault. That's what you want to be able to say to avoid liability. It comes down to that sort of basic material evidence at the end of the day. So let's keep going. Still on this additional client relationships, you've got additional resources, you've got training, all of these other items that I've mentioned before that are documented, and it's common to every one of these systems. So if we go to the other 5 systems, and I won't go through them in detail, we haven't got time, but you'll see that in the slide now before you, you've got the 7 systems enumerated there under those headings. As I say, there's nothing magical about the headings, but I do believe that the full version of this document contains every reference that you need and relates it to every system you need to have in place, cross-reference with those 9 criteria in order to enable you to be pretty confident that you've done all you can as a principal, as an owner, or even as an employee in a firm. And we'll just look quickly at, for instance, matter management. That's system number 2. Again, I'm not going to go through it. You can see that on page 6 of your handout. Considerable detail there, of course, more than there is in respect of client management, but the same layout, the same description of what it is that you're trying to achieve, followed up by 8 other references dealing with supervision, enforcement, training, and documentation that was required for every one of these systems to make them effective. And if we move on from there, you get to supervision and review. Same issue, same set out. In this case, I've just showed the description of the objectives, the aims, as it were, what it is that you're trying to achieve with that particular system. And naturally, as in every system, very specific references to the Act and the rules, even where there is duplication, as there often is, in the requirements that the Act and the rules set out, so that you can be confident, as I said, that these systems in combination will satisfy even the most careful auditor. So I want finally, just while we're dealing with the systems, and as I say, this is not really a system as such, but I do think it's a salutary point to be made. The last one on principal responsibilities is the one that I mentioned earlier. Was quite an eye-opener for me when I actually sat down and documented every one of these responsibilities. And as you will see, hopefully not from the screen, but from reference to your document at page 16, you'll see just how comprehensive those requirements are. Again, you won't be able to read it on the screen. I've just simply done a bit of a snapshot there and highlighted some of them just so that you can get a feel for what's required. But in some cases, as I suggested earlier, those the actual aims, you might think, go well beyond what the Act and the rules require. But again, if you took the question of, say, strategy, if you took the issue of the entry and progression of people within the firm, the role of principals, if you took any one of these requirements, even if it doesn't read directly onto an obligation, you'll rapidly appreciate that without it, your chances of actually running a system, let alone doing the training, the employment, and creating a repeatable, enforceable, compliant firm is exceedingly small. Firms, companies depend on systemisation of their practices, particularly where there is high regulatory involvement, and I don't think you could possibly argue with the fact that we've got a very high regulatory environment here. So you need to be very mindful of it and have systems that match it. So again, I'm not going to run through all of those. There's some 24 of them. I think you can see one I bang on about quite relentlessly is this one, number 15, meetings and protocols. Time and time again, I go to firms, they have team meetings, they have partners meetings, they have one-on-one meetings, they have reviews, etc. When you ask to see the documentation of those particular events, they're not there. They're certainly not collected. There's no system. And again, if you're talking about whether or not an individual practitioner or team leader or in an area of work that is not up to snuff has been addressed by management or anybody else for that matter, this is the type of documentation that you're going to have recourse to. The emails, the follow-up, the agenda, the action lists, all of that stuff you're probably creating, I hope you are, but are you retaining it? Can it be accessed relatively easily in the event of somebody going off the rails? If you can't point to this type of information, it becomes a matter of pure anecdote as to whether it's actually happened. And unfortunately, again, referring to some recent examples, if a practitioner is himself or herself responsible for some default in dealing with a client, for instance, or overcharging, the first line of defence is quite often, well, the firm doesn't provide me with this sort of system. There's no guidance, there's no mentoring, there's no review. This has never been raised with me before. I didn't have it as part of my induction process. Immediately throws it back on you to satisfy an auditor that there was such a thing, that they were given these sort of instructions, that it was part of the employment contract, that there is a book of policies in place. All of these things, again, not rocket science, but quite hard to actually get in place, quite hard to maintain, quite hard to keep up and current, and quite hard to keep all these 7 systems integrated. I don't for a moment think this is easy to do, but it's so much the important part of running a firm these days that you really have to give it a lot of your attention and, unfortunately, a bit of investment in order to make sure that things are working properly. So I want to just summarise quickly at this point. I've been told before that I bang on, but I don't summarise, so I'm going to summarise a bit. Obligations are extensive and overlapping. The outcomes and conduct are prescribed, but not how to do it, so that's up to you. Principals are liable for systemic failure within the organisation, and it's very easy to point to systemic failure. You can think of the number of manufacturers and food producers, some of whom I've represented over the years, who've ended up with bits of glass at the bottom of their bottles, etc., to appreciate what systemic failure can mean, particularly in something as complex as a motor car, and I don't think we think provision of legal services is any simpler. So a systems approach is required. The systems must be comprehensive, mutually reinforcing. They are, as I've said before, the very scaffold upon which the business should be built. If you haven't got the main planks of your scaffold in place, then look out. You need to work on them. You need to continually keep them at the forefront of your mind, and you need to think about them in a global sort of fashion, not just a one-off or a reactive issue. I mean, so much of the attention, for instance, in the promulgation of the Uniform Act was all about, the cost regime. Well, understandably, very, very prescriptive as to what's required. Similarly with your trust accounts and what have you. Nothing new really in all of that, however, but not much attention given to the overlying requirement to have a series of systems which ensures that these things are done properly and repeatedly done properly. That's hard to do, very hard to do. So just getting to the end of the meat of this particular session, how do you put it all in place? What do you do now? If you're thinking now, well, maybe I haven't got everything that's required, maybe we can get it up to pace. How should I approach this? Well, I think the first requirement is, of course, doing a self-assessment. I hope the sheet will be some benefit to you in doing that. You can buy the full sheet in the form of an offer at the end of the seminar, because there's a good deal more detail in the sheets than I've given you so far, and one that I hope gives you a comprehensive picture. And as I say, I'll put that up on the screen a bit later on. The self-assessment, however, really needs to be carried out on a sort of a project management basis, because it is a big project. You think about the time and effort required to actually go through those 6 or 7 systems, to check off where everything that's being done now, to see whether the policies that you've got in place are appropriate, to see whether the IT system actually interacts and performs in the way that you think it does, and that people are actually using it. And you're getting the reports and you're acting on them, and you're doing the supervision and you're doing the training and you're doing the reviews. Now, it's not something to be shy about. It's just something that you must do. There's only one way to find out what's going on in your firm, and that is to undertake a project of that nature. So the amount of time that's required, okay, given some thought to this, having looked at what it is that I'm recommending here and what I've been asked to do myself on several occasions on behalf of firms whose partners are busy getting and doing the work and charging for it. They haven't got the knowledge, they haven't got the time, they don't have the experience necessarily to understand how these systems can be put in place, let alone implemented, let alone reviewed, let alone in some cases actually sold to their partners and the employees. You do have to inculcate in the firm a positive attitude towards compliance and why it's so important, not only for you perhaps as a principal, but also for any up-and-coming solicitor who's working in a place that might expose him or her to auditory attention. It's not something that anybody welcomes. And if they don't know what they don't know, as our friend Mr. Runsfield would say, then you're putting them in a position of jeopardy which they shouldn't really be in. So it's your responsibility to get all these things in place. But the amount of time, what have I said on that slide? I've said normally one partner, usually a senior partner is required, a senior staff member is required. You need to collect the data initially. That can be quite a big task, particularly when you have to interrogate the people who are currently running the systems, the people who are doing the accounts, the people who are putting up the precedents, the people who are running the teams or are actually involved in checking the quality of the work or signing off on the accounts. All of those factors need to be reviewed with an idea of saying, well, we want to actually get to a point where we know what I call, have we got to base camp? What's our current position? Where are we? Where do we need attention to these systems? What are we going to do? How long is it going to take? And how do we know we're going to be across the line, even if we draw that line now? This is where, as I say, a project management approach is required. So I've estimated, and I've seen this happen, that, and I think these are fairly minimal estimates. I've said the initial analysis of the systems, reporting to your fellow partners or directors, usually 15 to 20 hours to collect the data and do the analysis, perhaps write something of a report, at least maybe a few PowerPoint slides, and get some agreement as to what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, how you're going to fund it, how you're going to document it, who's going to document it. Then you're probably talking about something in the order of that sort of time. So that's quickly going to get you to the point where you're looking at 20 to 25 hours of time, say $4.50 an hour, opportunity cost for any one partner, assuming they know what they're doing and they're going to complete the task, which again is a major problem for most firms. Start with the best of intentions, very soon runs off the rails when the partner concerned who's seized with this responsibility gets distracted. And having been a partner and part managing partner in my early days, I know how easily one gets distracted at doing billable work as opposed to non-billable work. The trade-off is always made in one direction, in my opinion. So you're looking at sort of maybe opportunity costs there of $10,000 to $12,000, and that's how expensive it is in order to actually do the base camp analysis, to do that initial report, and to get the project moving. So what I've going to put up at a moment on the screen for you, now again you can't read it here, but I'll put it up in the chat section in a moment, is an offer which I'll describe to you now, because you'll need to download this offer and consider it at your leisure post the seminar. But what I'm offering to do in this particular presentation here is to do that initial assessment, to do the project for about $5,000, $4,900 I've documented there. It's done over 3 months, and you are then in the position to say what further needs to be done in order to make the firm compliant. Obviously, policies and other documentation can be added to that task. It often is, but the base camp position I'm suggesting I can do for $5,000 or $4,900 payable over 3 months in order to get you in a position where you're confident that you comply in certain areas, where you know where your deficiencies are, and the way forward is clear from there in order to get the firm fully compliant. The other offer, which is somewhat briefer and somewhat cheaper, is the full copy of the documentation, part copy of which you've got already, which I'm normally sell for around about $5.50 a copy for you guys, and registering for this webinar, I'm offering it for $475. It's only a matter of sending me an email. I'll send you the full document so that you can see, in respect of every one of those systems, every one of those 9 criteria, every one of the legal obligations that you have. But at the moment, you've got sort of an edited sample, but not the full box and dice. And I do commend the rest of the documentation, because it certainly took a lot more time than might be reflected in that price in order to generate the document and have it checked for accuracy. But it's, I assure you, a comprehensive effort to actually put that in place. So let me just now put those documents up there for you. I'll start with the more comprehensive offer, the project management offer. So I'll just go off screen for a minute while I tap that down, just so bear with me a moment. I'm just going to the software now, loading it, and it'll probably take, I would guess, there's a bit of a time lag built into this seminar apparently, because it goes off to Google headquarters somewhere in the States and comes back, and the usual technology issues. But you'll see on the right of your screen, hopefully in a few seconds, if not already, the download, or the downloadable PDF. You simply have to click on the bar at the bottom of your screen to download that offer, and you'll be able to print it out and have a look at it in your own time. And hopefully you'll find that there's sufficient detail in there to justify what I think is a very a reasonable offer, and would aid, I think, any firm in addressing these issues in a comprehensive and satisfactory fashion. It's all too easy to bite away, bite-size at little bits and pieces of the problem, to fix them when criticisms or complaints are made, but to actually look at doing this over a period of 3 months and getting it all done and dusted, I think would help anybody sleep at night. It's a sort of thing which, quite frankly, looking back at my career, I should have addressed a lot easier, a lot earlier, and I would have been a lot happier had I done so. It's a somewhat bureaucratic process, but I think unavoidably so. So I do commend this this offer to you. So having put that up, and I'm just going to take it down in a minute and put the other offer up. If you see an email from me post this webinar, which you will, it'll contain downloads for both these offers in any event, and you're more than welcome to obviously access them in that regard and contact me. I'm up in Sydney usually every fortnight or so, and other than that, obviously floating around in Melbourne or up in Queensland, but I'm always online and easily contacted if you want to discuss any of the details with me.